Welcome back. This is Linda Bobbitt again. We're at part 6 of our video about the next steps for congregations to cultivate vitality. Hopefully you've been working through the workbook with me and you've just done page 6. You've thought about what are the stages you're going to go through to do adaptive change in your congregation. And these are the stages here in this cycle that we see, but they don't have to go in that particular order. So in the workbook you've thought about what are the different areas and who's going to do what. So now I want to talk to you about how you go about implementing that, because it turns out it matters. If you just do these things too simply, you can get a lot of busy work done and you won't actually have a transformed congregation. So I want to talk to you about something called the 7 I's. So these are the 7 I's. These are ways in which you engage those steps that will allow them to actually have a transformational impact on your congregation. And so let's talk about each one of those. The first one is it needs to be an intentional process. It cannot just be, well, let's just face it, big changes like this don't just happen. You have to make time and space for it, and you have to say, this group of people is going to do this conversation at this time, and we're going to hold them accountable for doing it, okay? Whether it's council or a vision or direction team or whatever the case may be, they need to have time and space for it, and they need to show up and do it. The next I is invested. People need to be invested in the outcome and expecting something to actually happen. Invested intellectually, but also emotionally, maybe financially. Okay, it's about, it has to matter enough for you to go about it. The next one is intimacy. People actually have to be part of one another's lives to risk something to do this, because there's going to be some grief and loss, there's going to be some excitement and engagement, but some risk-taking, and you're not really going to be willing to do that unless you're part of each other's lives enough to make it worth everybody's while. So how do you develop those relationships and be intimate enough that the way you move forward through this listening stage is going to actually have an impact? Finally, this needs to be integrated into the rest of the congregation, right? This is not the work of one small team. This has to be something you're all doing together and everybody knows about, and maybe not everybody's on board with it, because sometimes there's people who just aren't going to be. That's the nature of how change is adopted. But as many people as possible need to participate so that this is a congregation-wide transformation. There's also this need that the leadership has to be internal. So you may want to, and it may be a good idea to hire an external consultant to help you walk through this process, but they aren't running it, right? They can guide you, but you have to own it. You have to move it forward. I hope that makes some sense. Oops. Finally, you have to understand this whole process is inspired by and led really by the Holy Spirit. So you have to call on the Holy Spirit and expect the Holy Spirit to show up and do things in your congregation. God isn't somewhere else, and you're not trying to divine God's plan and then do it and hope God's happy with you. No, God is with you in each moment, walking alongside through all the stumbling and mumbling with you, okay? And leading and guiding, but also supporting from the sides, before and behind and beneath and around, okay? That's where God is. So, finally, the major outcome of this process is not a new thing you do. It's actually an expanded imagination. This is about getting out of your box and letting God give you new ideas and new ways of thinking. So you have to expect that to happen. You have to expect to change your mind. And that's kind of the most wonderful thing about the process, and also a little bit of a scary thing about the process. So what I want you to do now is go back to your workbook, which I'm going to go to on the screen. And you're going to flip the page to page 7. That goes through these 7 I's. Now take the plan you just developed and think about those 7 I's and say, how intentional is our plan? How invested are we? And is our plan going to make us more invested or enough invested in this? You see what I mean? So think about your plan and how you're going to move forward and rate it in these areas. And then after that, you're going to think about where are we going from here and how are we going to start our plan moving. As you're moving through the plan, in fact, after you do each step, I want you to come back to this 7 I's and reflect. Use this as a reflection tool. If we did a discernment process where we did dwelling in the Word in small groups across our congregation, was it intentional enough? Were people invested in it, right? Was it integrated through the congregation, or did we miss somebody? That's the kind of thing I want you to do. Use this as one of your reflection tools as you move through the process, and trust that the Holy Spirit is going to tell you how you need to tweak it and learn from it. And when you do these things, we've seen in congregations around the country, when they invest in this and they actually take the time to do it, there has been transformation. Imaginations are expanded, and congregations can become something new and beautiful that they never even imagined before. Because here's the thing. It's not so much about us making the congregation strong. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint real quick. It's more about, okay, that's the question. Our questions are going to be impacting our imagination. If we're saying to ourselves, how do we make our congregation strong and vital? We're basically saying, how do we build a better Jenga tower? Now, there's times for that, but there's also times we need to open up our minds more and say, where is God going to? And how can we, the church, join God now in this context? And that becomes the bigger question, because here's the thing. The world is changing. It's not just how it changes in our congregations. It's also moving up through a bigger change than we even can imagine. So if we go here and we look at this lower loop now as being the congregation, they kind of come and go over time. And above that we have denominations, for example. And above that we have just the whole wider church and God's whole plan. And if we think about history, we know there's been times in history when God has been building a church, like for instance when the Jewish people came into the Holy Land, right? They started a new community. But after a while, that new community, built on just being a people of the Promised Land, got kind of corrupted, because being people of the Promised Land didn't really connect them to God the way it needed to. They were worshiping other gods. At some point, that kind of fell apart. The Assyrians came and took out part of the kingdom. The Babylonians came and took out the rest, burned the temple. So the church that had been all about the temple, a place you go to be church, now didn't have that. And they had to figure out, who are we, a people of God, without a place to go? And that's this time of transition when they were in Babylonia. Remember, Jeremiah said, it's okay, you're going to be here well, take wives, plant farms, it's going to be okay. God's still with you. And sure enough, God was. And in fact, in that time, that very scary time when they could have lost everything, they spent time looking in and saying, who are we really? Who are we, this people of God? And that's when much of the Old Testament got written down. That's a time of extraordinary capacity building and extraordinary imagination and innovations, right? So just writing this stuff down. So then when they started that cycle again, they started over with, this is who we are. We are a people of the book. We're a people of the law. And then sure enough, they were a people of the law. And it got to the time of Jesus when the law was almost more important than the message of God underneath the law, which is what Jesus tried to say in a lot of ways. Jesus died, and that was through the disciples into crisis. But what really kicked it off was the destruction of the second temple here. When the new Christians had to say, well, they were Jewish people mostly, right? They had to say, well, who are we now? If we're not just a reformation in the Jewish movement, we don't have a temple to go to, we don't have a synagogue to talk at. Who are we? What are we about? And they took those many years trying to form the new sense of what it meant to be Christian, especially with these Gentiles mixed in. So that process was that back loop, that adaptive loop. How do we adapt to the fact that there's no longer a place to be? And it started over again when we got to Constantine, and the Christian church became the church of the Western world. And so you can kind of see how this goes. It's gone around a few times. We hit the Reformation. That's another time of crisis. And then the reforming of what does it even mean to be Lutheran? We have the Orthodox movement, the Pietist movement. All those things got us back to this new idea of what it means to have church. And what it meant to have church was a state church. But there were now Protestant churches and Catholic churches and different kinds of Protestant churches. That is actually right there. That's kind of where the world was for a long time. And that is where the world was when the immigrants came to this country. And when they started churches, they started the Swedish church and the Norwegian church and all these different churches to be with their community, but because that's what church was, it was kind of how community was organized. And so if that's how our denominations were shaped here in this country, and then that was how most of our congregations were shaped too. But here's the thing, as you all know, our world isn't like that anymore. Our society is no longer grounded in the congregation as the center of community. And it's also no longer grounded in a particular culture as the center of community, at least not on a large scale. So all these other things are pulling people around in different directions. We're entering one of these times when we have to learn, what does it mean to be people of faith? What does it mean to be church when the church building isn't the middle of it? Just like the ancient Israelites had to figure out what it meant to be church without a temple. And just like the Christians had to figure out how to be a church without a synagogue to go speak in. Now we too have the opportunity to rediscover who we are, to have this time of amazing creativity. What are we going to write down? What stories are we going to tell that are going to hold on to our faith, that are going to transmit it to people who don't know anything about it, even if we don't have these buildings all around us, even if it isn't about just a place, but it's about God's movement in our world today. That's what's impacting our denominations now, and that's what's impacting our congregations, but it goes both ways, right? So there's a lot of innovation going on in congregations all over this country. And that innovation is now driving changes in denominations. And that innovation in denominations will ultimately drive changes in our whole society, because you know what? That's how this works. It's a very exciting time to be a Christian in the world. And I know it can be scary and intimidating, but we got to remember, God has been through this entire process before, lots of times. We are in a really privileged position to get to see it starting to unfold before our eyes now. We just got to remember that God's driving this, God's part of it, God's promises continue to remain and be real. So may God bless and keep you as you continue on this journey, and remember and trust that God's promises are going to pull you forward through it, no matter what the outcome might be, because God is building something different. And we don't even know what that is right now, but maybe it looks completely different than anything we've ever seen before. Maybe God's looking forward to how our blocks can be combined with other blocks and other churches and communities and people like that to build something entirely new for this entirely new world. So thank you for the time you've taken to listen to these videos, and I hope and I pray that God blesses and keeps your congregation moving forward in trusting God. Thank you.